David sat in the back corner of his classroom, staring at the math test in front of him. The numbers seemed to dance around on the page, rearranging themselves every time he tried to focus. His palms were sweaty and his heart was beating so fast he could hear it in his ears. This was the same feeling he got every single time. That horrible sinking sensation that made his mind go completely blank. He had studied for this test. Really studied. His mom had helped him for 3 hours the night before, going over every problem until he could solve them perfectly at the kitchen table. But now, sitting here with the clock ticking and his classmates scribbling away confidently, everything he had learned seemed to vanish into thin air. The teacher walked between the rows of desks, her shoes clicking against the floor. David picked up his pencil and wrote his name at the top. That was the easy part. Then he looked at the first question and felt his stomach drop. He knew he had seen this type of problem before. He knew there was a formula he was supposed to use. But which one was it? 20 minutes passed. David had only answered 3 questions out of 20. He looked around and saw other students already on the second page. Some had even finished and were sitting quietly, waiting for the time to be up. He felt that familiar burning sensation behind his eyes. He was not going to cry, not here, not again. When the bell rang, David handed in his paper with most of the answers blank. He already knew what would happen. In a few days, he would get it back with red marks all over it. Another D, maybe even an F this time. He had a whole collection of these papers stuffed in the bottom of his backpack, ones he had not shown his parents yet. This had been his life for as long as he could remember. While other kids seemed to breeze through school, getting gold stars and honor roll certificates, David struggled with every single test. It did not matter what subject it was, math, science, history, English. The moment he had to take a test, his brain just shut down. His parents could not understand it. They were not mean about it, but he could see the disappointment in their eyes. His dad would sit him down and give him talks about trying harder, about applying himself. His mom would compare him to his older sister, who had gotten straight A's and was now in college on a scholarship. They never said it directly, but David knew what they were thinking. Why could not he be more like her? His teachers were even worse. Some of them seemed to think he was just lazy. One teacher had actually said in front of the whole class that if David spent less time daydreaming and more time paying attention, maybe he would not be failing. The other kids had laughed. David had wanted to disappear. But the truth was, David was not lazy. He spent hours studying. He would read his textbooks over and over, trying to make the information stick in his brain. He would make flashcards and practice problems. He would watch videos online explaining the concepts in different ways, and it would work, sort of. When he was alone without pressure, he could figure things out. He could solve the problems. He could remember the facts. It was only when test time came that everything fell apart. Something about the pressure, the time limit, the quiet room full of other people who all seemed to know what they were doing. It made his mind freeze up completely. His hands would shake. His vision would get blurry. And all that studying, all those hours of work would just vanish. By the time David reached his senior year of high school, he had accepted his fate. He was a failure. That was just who he was. His grade point average was barely above a 2.0. He had taken the college entrance exams twice and bombed them both times. While his classmates were getting acceptance letters from universities, David was getting rejection after rejection. His guidance counselor had suggested maybe college was not for him. Maybe he should look into trade schools or just get a job after graduation. The counselor had said it in a kind way, but David heard what she really meant. He was not smart enough for college. He was not good enough. The worst part was not even the bad grades or the failed tests. It was the way it made him feel about himself. David had started to believe that he was actually stupid, that there was something wrong with him, that he would never amount to anything. He watched his classmates make plans for their futures, talking about the colleges they would attend and the careers they would have, and he felt like he was being left behind. His best friend tried to cheer him up. They had been friends since elementary school, and his friend had watched David struggle year after year. Tests do not measure everything, his friend would say. You are good at other stuff. You are the person everyone comes to when they need help with something. You can fix anything. You are great with people. But those things did not matter when it came to school. They did not show up on report cards or transcripts. They did not get you into college or help you land a good job. As far as David could tell, the only thing that mattered in life was how well you could take tests, and he was terrible at it. Graduation day came and went. David walked across the stage and got his diploma, but he felt nothing. No pride, no sense of accomplishment. He had barely made it through by the skin of his teeth. He had no plans for the fall. No college acceptance, no job lined up, just a vague sense of dread about the future. His parents threw him a small graduation party, but it felt awkward. Relatives kept asking him what he was going to do next, where he was going to college. David mumbled something about taking a year off to figure things out. He could see the pity in their eyes. Everyone knew the truth. He was the one who had not made it. The one who had failed. That summer, David applied to dozens of jobs. Most of them did not even call him back. The ones that did were offering minimum wage positions that did not require any skills. Finally, he got a call from the local hospital. They needed someone for the night shift in housekeeping. It was not glamorous, but it was something. David took the job without hesitation. At least it was a start, even if it felt like admitting defeat. David's first night at the hospital was overwhelming. The building was huge, with dozens of hallways that all looked the same. His supervisor, an older man named Mr. Rodriguez, showed him around quickly, pointing out supply closets and explaining which floors he would be responsible for. David tried to memorize everything, but by the end of the tour, his head was spinning. His job was simple enough. Mop the floors, empty the trash cans, clean the bathrooms, wipe down surfaces. Nothing that required a college degree. Nothing that required passing tests. He started at 11 at night and worked until 7 in the morning, when the day shift would take over. The hospital was quieter at night, but it never truly slept. There were always nurses moving through the halls, doctors checking on patients, machines beeping, and people coming and going. At first, David felt invisible. Nurses and doctors would walk right past him as if he was not even there. He was just the guy with the mop bucket. Nobody looked him in the eye or said hello. He would be cleaning a hallway, and people would step around him without acknowledging his existence. It stung a little, but he told himself it did not matter. This was just a paycheck. A way to save up money while he figured out what to do with his life. But something strange started to happen after a few weeks. David began to notice things. He noticed which patients were left alone most of the time, with no visitors coming to check on them. He noticed which family members looked exhausted, falling asleep in uncomfortable chairs in the waiting rooms. He noticed when a patient seemed confused or scared, calling out for help when the nurses were too busy to hear them. One night, David was mopping the 4th floor when he heard an elderly woman crying in her room. The door was partially open, and he could see her lying in bed, tears running down her face. He hesitated. This was not his job. He was supposed to clean and move on. But something made him stop. He knocked gently on the door frame and asked if she was okay. The woman looked surprised that anyone had noticed her. She told David that she could not sleep. She was scared about her surgery in the morning, and her family lived 3 states away. They could not afford to come visit. She had been lying there all night, alone with her fears. David pulled up a chair and sat with her. He was not good at much, but he could listen. He let her talk about her worries, about her life, about her grandchildren she missed. He stayed for 20 minutes, and by the time he left, she had stopped crying and was smiling. It became a pattern. David started noticing people who needed something beyond medical care. A young father who had been keeping vigil in the intensive care unit for days, living on vending machine food. David brought him a sandwich from the cafeteria before it closed. An older man who kept getting lost trying to find his wife's room. David walked him there personally and wrote down the room number and floor for him. A teenage girl who was scared and alone waiting for test results. David sat with her and made her laugh with silly jokes. The nurses began to notice what David was doing. At first, they seemed surprised. The janitor was going above and beyond his duties. But then they started to rely on him. They would ask him to check on certain patients when they were swamped. They knew David had a way with people, a kindness that put patients at ease. One of the nurses, an experienced woman named Rita, pulled him aside one night. "You have a gift," she told him. "You see people. Really see them. That is rare, especially in a place like this where everyone is so busy." David did not know what to say. Nobody had ever told him he had a gift before. He had spent his whole life being told what he could not do, what he was not good at. But here, In the quiet halls of the hospital during the night shift, he had found something he could do, something that mattered. His job also taught him things he had never learned in school. He learned about different medical conditions by listening to doctors talk. He learned how to spot warning signs in patients by watching the nurses work. He learned which medications were used for what, how to read the monitors in patient rooms, what different alarms meant. Nobody was teaching him directly, but he absorbed information like a sponge, just by being observant and curious. One night, David watched as a team of doctors and nurses worked to save a patient who was coding. He stood back out of the way, but his eyes tracked every movement. He watched how they did chest compressions, how they used the defibrillator, how they worked together with calm urgency. He watched the lead doctor call out instructions, watched how everyone knew their role. It was like a carefully choreographed dance, and even though it was an emergency, there was a strange kind of order to it. The patient survived, and David felt his heart swell with emotion. These people were heroes. They saved lives every single day, and even though he was just the janitor, he was part of this place too. He kept the hospital clean so that patients would not get infections. He made sure the halls were safe so nobody would slip and fall. He provided comfort to people who were scared and alone. It might not seem like much, but it mattered. Months passed, and David settled into his role. He knew the hospital inside and out now. He knew which elevator was the fastest, which stairwell was the quietest, where the good coffee machine was hidden. He knew most of the regular night shift staff by name, and they knew him. He was no longer invisible. He was David, the janitor who actually cared, but he still carried that weight from his past. Late at night, when things were slow, he would think about his old classmates. He wondered what they were doing now, probably excelling in college, getting internships, making their parents proud. Meanwhile, here he was, mopping floors and emptying trash cans. He had not failed at this job, but sometimes it felt like his life was still one big failure. His parents would call and ask how things were going. David would tell them work was fine, but he could hear the unspoken questions. When was he going to do something more with his life? When was he going to go back to school or find a real career? They tried to hide their disappointment, but it was there. Their daughter was a college graduate with a good job. Their son was a janitor. David tried not to think about it too much. He focused on his work, on the small moments of connection with patients, on the satisfaction of doing his job well. He told himself that this was enough, that not everyone needed to be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, that there was dignity in any honest work. But deep down, he still felt like he was meant for something more. He just did not know what that something was or how to get there. One evening, Rita the nurse pulled David aside again. She had been watching him for months now, seeing how he interacted with patients, how he had learned so much just by paying attention. She asked him if he had ever thought about becoming a nurse or a medical technician. David laughed it off. Him? In the medical field? He had barely graduated high school. There was no way he could handle the schooling required for those jobs. More tests, more studying, more chances to fail. But Rita was persistent. She told him that some of the best medical professionals she had ever worked with were not the ones with perfect grades. They were the ones with heart, with compassion, with the ability to stay calm under pressure. She said she saw those qualities in him. David appreciated her words, but he did not believe them. Not really. He had been told his whole life that he was not cut out for anything important. Why would this be any different? Still, her words planted a seed in his mind. What if there was more to life than test scores? What if his failures in school did not define his entire future? What if there was a path forward that he had not considered? David did not have answers to these questions, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a tiny spark of hope. It was a Tuesday night, around 2 a.m. David was on the 3rd floor, pushing his mop bucket down the long hallway near the cardiac unit. The floor was mostly quiet at this hour. Most patients were sleeping, and the nurses were catching up on paperwork at their station. The only sounds were the soft beeping of monitors and the squeak of David's mop bucket wheels. He had just finished cleaning one of the patient bathrooms when he heard a loud thud, followed by a woman's scream. David dropped his mop and ran toward the sound. His heart was pounding. In his 9 months working at the hospital, he had seen a lot of things, but that scream had genuine terror in it. When he rounded the corner, he saw chaos. An elderly man was lying on the floor in the middle of the hallway. His wife was on her knees beside him, shaking his shoulders and crying his name. A visitor, some young guy who looked completely panicked, was just standing there frozen. The patient's face was gray and his eyes were half open but not really seeing anything. David's mind went into overdrive. He had seen this before. Not in person, but he had watched it happen enough times from the sidelines. The man was having a heart attack, maybe worse. Where were the nurses? David looked toward the nurses' station, but it was empty. They must have been dealing with something in another room. The emergency call button was on the wall, but nobody was pressing it. Everyone was just panicking. Something clicked in David's brain. All those months of watching, of learning, of absorbing everything around him. He knew what needed to happen. The man needed CPR immediately. Every second counted. David did not think about whether he was qualified or whether he would get in trouble. He just moved. He dropped to his knees beside the man and looked at the wife. "Ma'am, I need you to step back, okay? I'm going to help him." His voice was calm, way calmer than he felt inside. The woman looked at him with desperate, hopeful eyes and moved aside. David tilted the man's head back to open his airway, just like he had seen the doctors do. He checked for breathing. Nothing. He placed his hands on the man's chest, lacing his fingers together the way he had watched countless times. Then he started compressions. Hard and fast. He counted in his head. 1, 2, 3, 4. He had watched the nurses do this. 30 compressions, then 2 breaths. Keep the rhythm steady. Do not stop. The man's chest moved up and down with each compression. David's arms were already starting to burn, but he did not slow down. He shouted to the frozen visitor, "You! Run to the nurses' station down that hall and tell them we need help. Now!" The young man snapped out of his daze and took off running. David kept going. Sweat was dripping down his face. 15, 16, 17. His training was not formal, but he had paid attention. He had watched this exact scenario play out at least a dozen times. 28, 29, 30. He moved to give rescue breaths, tilting the man's head back, pinching his nose and breathing into his mouth. The man's chest rose. Good. He went back to compressions. The wife was praying beside him, her hands clasped together. Another visitor had appeared and was just staring in shock. David blocked them all out. All that mattered was keeping this man's blood pumping, keeping oxygen moving through his body until the real professionals could get here. Where were they? It felt like hours, but it had probably only been a minute. David's arms were screaming now, but he did not stop. He could not stop. If he stopped, this man would die. 45, 46, 47. Keep going. Stay focused. Do not think about anything else. Then he heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Running footsteps and Rita's voice shouting orders. "Get the crash cart. Call the code." The hallway suddenly filled with people. Nurses, doctors, all of them moving with practiced urgency. Rita dropped down beside David. "Keep going. You are doing great." David kept doing compressions while the team set up around him. Someone was attaching monitors. Someone else was preparing the defibrillator. A doctor was barking out instructions. After what felt like forever but was probably only 30 more seconds, Rita put her hand on David's shoulder. "Okay, we've got him. Move back." David stumbled backward, his arms shaking and his chest heaving. He watched as the medical team took over. They shocked the man's heart once, nothing. They shocked him again. This time the monitor started showing a rhythm. The doctor checked for a pulse. "We've got him back." "Get him to the cardiac unit now." They loaded the man onto a gurney and rushed him away. The wife followed, crying but hopeful now. Within seconds, the hallway was empty again except for David, who was sitting against the wall trying to catch his breath. His whole body was trembling. He looked down at his hands and saw they were shaking uncontrollably. Rita came back a few minutes later and sat down beside him on the floor. She did not say anything at first, just sat there with him. Finally, she spoke. "David, do you realize what you just did? That man would be dead right now if you had not acted. The nurses were dealing with another emergency 2 floors up. By the time we would have gotten here without your call, it would have been too late." David could not speak. He just stared at the floor where the man had been lying. He had done that, him, the guy who failed every test in school, the guy who everyone said would never amount to anything. He had just saved someone's life. "How did you know what to do?" Rita asked. David shrugged, still trying to process everything. "I have been watching. All these months I have been watching you guys work. I have seen you do CPR before. I have seen codes happen. I just did what I've seen you do." Rita shook her head in amazement. Most people freeze in that situation. Even people with training sometimes panic. But you stayed calm. You remembered the steps. You kept going even though it was exhausting. Do you understand how incredible that is? Over the next hour, more staff members came by to talk to David. They had heard what happened. The doctor who had taken over the code came to shake his hand. The hospital's night supervisor came to thank him personally. Security had pulled the footage from the hallway cameras and confirmed everything. David had performed CPR for nearly 3 minutes before help arrived. Those 3 minutes had saved the patient's life. The man's wife found David before her husband was taken into surgery. She hugged him so tightly he could barely breathe, thanking him over and over through her tears. She told him her husband's name was George and they had been married for 42 years. They had grandchildren who still needed their grandfather. Because of David, George would get to meet his newest grandchild who was due in 2 months. David went home that morning as the sun was rising, but he could not sleep. He kept replaying everything in his mind. The sound of the thud, the wife's scream, the feeling of doing chest compressions. The moment when George's heart started beating again. He had done that. He had actually done that. For his entire life, David had been told he was a failure. He had failed tests, failed classes, failed to get into college. He had believed that he was not good enough, not smart enough, not capable of anything important. But tonight he had been tested in a completely different way, not with a piece of paper and a number 2 pencil, but with a real human life hanging in the balance. And he had passed. He had not frozen. He had not panicked. He had not run away or waited for someone else to handle it. He had stepped up and done what needed to be done. All those months of watching and learning, of being invisible but observant, had prepared him for that moment. The knowledge had been there in his brain the whole time, just waiting for the right situation to come out. Maybe Rita was right. Maybe there was more to intelligence than test scores. Maybe being smart was not just about memorizing facts and filling in bubbles on a Scantron sheet. Maybe it was about knowing what to do when it really mattered, about staying calm under pressure, about having the courage to act when everyone else was frozen. David finally fell asleep around noon, exhausted but feeling something he had not felt in years. Pride. Real, genuine pride in himself. He had no idea that this night would change the entire course of his life. When David returned to work the next night, everything felt different. As soon as he walked through the hospital doors, people started stopping him. Nurses he had never spoken to before came up to shake his hand. Doctors he had only seen from a distance nodded at him with respect. Even the security guards at the front desk congratulated him. Word had spread fast about what he had done. Rita found him before he could even get his cleaning supplies. David, the hospital administrator wants to see you. She called down specifically asking for you to come to her office before you start your shift. David's stomach dropped. He had never been to the administrator's office. He had never even seen the hospital administrator in person. She was like some mythical figure who existed on the top floor, far removed from the janitors and hourly workers. Why would she want to see him? Was he in trouble? Had he done something wrong by performing CPR without being officially certified? He took the elevator to the 5th floor, his mind racing with worry. The administrative offices were nice, with carpet instead of linoleum and real artwork on the walls instead of those generic hospital posters. A secretary greeted him with a warm smile and told him to go right in. The administrator, Mrs. Patricia Owens, was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and kind eyes. She stood up from behind her desk when David entered and reached out to shake his hand. "David, please sit down. I have been wanting to meet you." David sat in the chair across from her desk, his hands gripping his knees nervously. He waited for whatever was coming. "I want to start by saying thank you," Mrs. Owens began. "What you did last night was extraordinary. I have reviewed the security footage and spoken with all the staff members who were involved. You saved Mr. George Patterson's life. Do you understand the significance of that?" David nodded slowly. "I just did what I thought was right, ma'am," Mrs. Owens smiled. "That is exactly my point. In a crisis situation, when every second mattered, you did not hesitate. You knew what to do and you did it. The nurses told me you have been working here for 9 months. In that time you have made quite an impression, but not just because of last night." She pulled out a folder from her desk. "I asked the nursing staff to give me feedback about you. Do you know what they said? They said you are observant. You notice things other people miss. You care about patients. You have learned more about hospital procedures and medical care just from watching than some people learn in formal training. Several nurses specifically mentioned that you have what they call a natural instinct for emergency situations. David did not know what to say. He had just been doing his job and trying to help where he could. Mrs. Owens leaned forward. David, I looked at your employment file. I saw that you did not attend college. May I ask why? David felt his face get hot. Here it was. The shame that never really went away. I am not good at school, ma'am. I barely graduated high school. I failed tests. College was not really an option for me. Mrs. Owens nodded thoughtfully. I see. And yet last night you performed CPR perfectly. You kept your composure during an emergency, when even trained professionals sometimes panic. You have learned complex medical procedures just from observation. Does that sound like someone who is not smart to you? David did not answer. He had never thought about it that way. I have been in healthcare administration for 30 years, Mrs. Owens continued, and I have learned that there are different types of intelligence. There is book intelligence, yes, but there is also emotional intelligence. Practical intelligence, the ability to read situations and people, the ability to act decisively under pressure. You have those qualities in abundance, David. Those are the qualities that make great emergency responders. She opened another folder on her desk. I want to make you an offer. The hospital has a program where we sponsor employees to get their EMT certification. We pay for the training, and in return you commit to working for our ambulance service for at least 2 years after you are certified. I think you would be an excellent candidate for this program. David felt like someone had punched him in the chest. EMT training, him? But ma'am, there are tests in that program. Written exams. I will fail them. I always fail tests, Mrs. Owens smiled gently. Let me tell you something about the EMT program. Yes, there are written tests, but they are not like the tests you took in school. They are practical, focused on real situations you will face. And more importantly, the program has practical examinations where you demonstrate actual skills. From what I have seen, you will excel at those. She pulled out some papers and slid them across the desk. I am not saying it will be easy, but I am saying you can do it. And I am saying that this hospital believes in you enough to invest in your training. What happened last night proves something important. You have been tested in the most real way possible, and you passed. You did not just pass, David, you excelled. David looked at the papers but could not focus on the words. His mind was spinning. This did not make sense. People like him did not get opportunities like this. People who failed in school did not become medical professionals. There had to be a catch. Why me? He asked quietly. There are other people who work here who probably have better grades, better backgrounds. Mrs. Owens sat back in her chair. Because last night when Mr. Patterson collapsed in that hallway, you were the one who stepped up. Not because you had a degree or certification, not because it was your job, but because you saw someone who needed help and you knew what to do. That is the kind of person we want responding to emergencies. Someone who acts instead of overthinks. Someone who cares more about saving lives than following protocols. She pointed to the papers. These are the enrollment forms for the next EMT training class. It starts in 2 weeks. Take them home. Think about it. Talk to your family. But David, I really hope you say yes. You have a gift, and it would be a waste for you to spend your life thinking you are not good enough when you are actually extraordinary. David took the papers with shaking hands. He thanked Mrs. Owens and left her office in a daze. As he walked back to the elevator, he passed by several staff members who smiled at him. One doctor actually stepped aside and held the door for him. David, the janitor. People were treating him differently now. With respect. With admiration. He went through his shift that night barely paying attention to his work. His mind kept going back to what Mrs. Owens had said. You have been tested in the most real way possible, and you passed. Could that be true? Could his whole life have been preparing him for something different than what he had always thought? When his shift ended, David did not go straight home. Instead, he went to the cafeteria and sat down with a cup of coffee. He spread the enrollment papers out on the table and actually read them. The EMT program was 16 weeks long. Classes twice a week, plus practical training sessions. There would be textbook reading, written exams, skills assessments, and a final certification test. Just reading about all the tests made his stomach hurt. But then he remembered last night, kneeling on that cold floor doing chest compressions on Mr. Patterson. His hands had known what to do. His brain had known the steps. When it really mattered, he had not failed. He had not frozen. He had not second-guessed himself. Rita found him sitting there and slid into the booth across from him. "So, did Mrs. Owens make you the offer?" David nodded. "She wants me to do the EMT program." "And?" Rita prompted. "And I am terrified," David admitted. "Rita, I am not kidding when I say I am terrible at tests. What if I fail out of the program? What if I waste the hospital's money and everyone's time?" Rita reached across and tapped the enrollment papers. "David, I have been a nurse for 23 years. I have worked with hundreds of EMTs and paramedics. Some of them graduated top of their class with perfect scores. And some of them I would not trust to handle a paper cut. You know what made the difference? It was not their test scores. It was how they performed when things went wrong, how they stayed calm, how they thought on their feet, how much they actually cared about their patients." She looked him straight in the eye. "Last night, you proved you have what it takes. The rest is just paperwork. And yeah, the classes might be hard for you, but you know what? You can study. You can ask for help. You can work twice as hard as everyone else if you need to. But that thing you did last night, that calmness under pressure, that cannot be taught. You either have it or you do not. And you definitely have it." David felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He had spent so many years believing he was worthless, that his inability to pass tests meant he could not do anything important, but maybe he had been measuring himself against the wrong standards all along. 2 weeks later, David walked into his first EMT training class. His hands were sweating so badly he had to wipe them on his jeans. The classroom was in a building next to the hospital, and there were about 20 other students there. Most of them looked young, fresh out of high school or college. They all seemed confident, chatting with each other about their backgrounds. David heard one guy talking about his biology degree. Another woman mentioned she was a nursing student doing this for extra certification. David felt completely out of place. He found a seat in the back corner and tried to make himself invisible. Old habits died hard. The instructor, a former paramedic named Jack Torres, walked in and immediately commanded attention. He was probably in his 40s, built like someone who had spent years lifting patients and equipment. He had the kind of presence that made you sit up straighter. "Welcome to EMT basic training," he started. "Over the next 16 weeks, some of you will decide this is not for you. That is okay. This job is not for everyone. It is physically demanding. It is emotionally draining. You will see things that will stick with you forever. But for those who make it through, you will have one of the most rewarding careers possible. You will save lives. You will be there for people during the worst moments of their existence. That is a privilege and a responsibility." He went on to explain the course structure. There would be lectures on anatomy, physiology, medical procedures, and emergency protocols. There would be written tests after each unit. There would be practical skills labs where they would practice on mannequins and each other. And at the end, there would be a national certification exam that they all had to pass. David felt his old anxiety creeping in. Tests. Of course there would be tests. Why did he think this would be different? The first few weeks were brutal. The textbook they were given was thick and dense, filled with medical terminology that looked like a foreign language. David would read the same page 5 times and still not retain the information. While other students seemed to breeze through the reading assignments, David struggled with every chapter. The first written test came in week 3. David studied for days, making flashcards, reading his notes over and over, watching videos online to help explain the concepts. When test day came, he felt that familiar panic settling in. The classroom suddenly felt too hot. The questions on the page seemed to swim around. His mind went blank. He failed. 62%. You needed a 70 to pass. David stared at the red F on his paper and felt everything come crashing down. Here we go again. Same story, different setting. He was foolish to think this would be any different. He started gathering his things, ready to drop out before he embarrassed himself further. But Jack Torres called him aside after class. "David, walk with me." They went outside, and Jack leaned against the building. "So you failed your first test. How are you feeling about that?" David shrugged, not trusting himself to speak without his voice cracking. Let me tell you something, Jack said. I have been teaching this course for 12 years. I can usually tell within the first few weeks who is going to make a good EMT and who is not, and it is never the people who ace every written test. You know who makes the best EMTs? The ones who actually care, the ones who pay attention during the practical sessions, the ones who ask questions because they genuinely want to understand, not just to pass a test. He looked at David directly. Mrs. Owens told me about what you did, how you saved that patient's life before you had any formal training. That tells me more about your potential than any written test ever could. But I failed, David said quietly. I always fail tests. That is just who I am. Jack shook his head. No, that is what you have been told you are. There is a difference. Listen, the written tests are important. You need to know the material. But we have tutoring available. We have study groups. I can give you extra time on tests if you need it. There are accommodations we can make. But here is what I cannot teach someone. I cannot teach them to stay calm in a crisis. I cannot teach them to care about strangers. I cannot teach them to act when everyone else freezes. You already have those things. The rest we can work on. David agreed to keep going, mostly because he did not want to disappoint the people who had invested in him. Jack connected him with another student named Kevin, who was great at the academic side, and agreed to tutor David. They met 3 times a week going over the material until it started to make sense. Kevin had a way of explaining things that the textbook did not. He used real-world examples and stories instead of just definitions. The next written test, David got a 74. He passed. Barely, but he passed. It was the first test he had passed in years, and he almost cried with relief. But where David really started to shine was in the practical sessions. They practiced taking vital signs, performing CPR, treating wounds, immobilizing spines, delivering babies. These hands-on skills came naturally to David. His months of watching the hospital staff had taught him more than he realized. When they practiced patient assessment, David could quickly identify problems that other students missed. When they ran through emergency scenarios, David stayed calm and systematic while others got flustered. Jack pulled him aside after one particularly complex training scenario. That was textbook perfect. You kept your crew calm, you prioritized correctly, you communicated clearly. Where did you learn to do that? David thought about all those nights. In the hospital, watching codes and emergencies, absorbing everything like a sponge. I guess I just paid attention. The 16 weeks crawled by. David continued to struggle with written tests, usually passing with the minimum score needed. But his practical exam scores were among the highest in the class. The other students started coming to him for help with the hands-on skills. During scenario training, everyone wanted David on their team because he had a way of taking charge without being bossy, of seeing the big picture while not missing small details. Finally, it was time for the National Certification Exam. This was it. The big test that would determine if all these months of work meant anything. The exam had 2 parts, a written section and a practical skills section. David needed to pass both. The night before the exam, David could not sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. What if he froze up on the written section? What if all that studying was not enough? What if he let down everyone who had believed in him? But then he thought about Mr. Patterson, about kneeling on that cold hospital floor doing chest compressions, saving a life. He thought about what Jack had said. You have been tested in the most real way possible, and you passed. The written exam was as hard as David feared. He sat in that testing center, sweating through questions about medications and protocols and anatomical terms. Some questions he knew, some he had to guess on. When he finished and submitted it, he had no idea if he had passed or failed. The results would come in a few days, but the practical exam, that was different. David moved through each station with confidence. Start an IV, perform CPR, assess a trauma patient, handle a cardiac emergency, assist with childbirth. His hands knew what to do. His mind stayed clear and focused. He was not thinking about passing or failing. He was just doing what needed to be done. When both results came back a week later, David opened the email with shaking hands. Written exam 76% passed. Practical exam 94% passed. He had done it. He was a certified EMT. The hospital threw him a small celebration. Mrs. Owens was there along with Rita, Jack, and several of the nurses David had worked with. They gave him his new uniform and his hospital ID badge that now said Emergency Medical Technician instead of housekeeping. But the real celebration came a month later. David was working his first real shift on the ambulance when they got a call. Cardiac arrest at a grocery store. When they arrived, there was a crowd of panicked people standing around a collapsed man. David's partner started setting up equipment, but David was already on his knees beside the patient, checking for breathing, starting chest compressions. Everything he had learned came together in that moment. The written knowledge, the practical skills, the experience from watching, the natural calm he had always possessed. He and his partner worked seamlessly together, following protocols, staying focused. They got the patient's heart started again before they even loaded him into the ambulance. On the drive to the hospital, David looked at the patient hooked up to monitors, his chest rising and falling, his heart beating steadily. This man would live. He would go home to his family. He would get another chance at life. Because David had been there. Because David had not given up on himself. Over the next 2 years, David responded to hundreds of calls. Car accidents, heart attacks, strokes, overdoses, difficult births, you name it. He saved 43 lives. 43 people who went home to their families because David showed up and did his job. He kept every thank you card he received. They covered an entire wall in his apartment. Sometimes when he had a hard shift, he would read through them. Letters from grateful families, from patients who survived, from people whose lives he had touched. None of them cared what his high school GPA was. None of them asked about his test scores. They cared that he had been there when they needed him most. David's parents came to visit and saw the wall of thank you cards. His mom cried. His dad hugged him and said he was proud. They finally understood that success was not about grades or degrees. It was about impact. It was about character. It was about showing up when it mattered. One day, David ran into his old high school guidance counselor at a coffee shop. She did not recognize him at first, but when he introduced himself, her eyes went wide. She asked what he was doing now, probably expecting to hear he was still working minimum wage jobs. I am a paramedic. David said simply, I save lives. Her mouth actually dropped open. David smiled and excused himself. He did not need her validation anymore. He had spent too many years believing that failing tests made him a failure as a person. But life had taught him something different. The biggest test was not on paper. It was not in a classroom. It was in those moments when someone needed help and you had to choose to act or walk away. It was staying calm when everyone else panicked. It was caring about people even when nobody was watching. It was being brave enough to try even when everyone told you that you were not good enough. David had failed every academic test they threw at him. His transcripts were full of C's and D's and F's. But when it came to the test that actually mattered, the test of character, the test of courage, the test of compassion, he had passed with flying colors. And in the end, that was the only test that really counted.